Okay, so we are here today to talk about rhetoric. As you should remember from the first couple of days of this course, what we study in AP Language is rhetoric. Now, what is rhetoric? Well, that's what we're going to try to define over the first couple of videos that you can watch as part of this class. Now, this video is going to follow along pretty closely with Chapter 1 of your textbook, The Language of Composition. Really, I'm going to be narrating a lot of stuff from pages 1 through 12 of that textbook. So it would be a good idea to go over those pages before you watch the presentation or to follow along with it while you're listening to the presentation. So before we go any further, let's try to define what we mean by rhetoric. Well, rhetoric is a really old concept. The first couple of definitions you'll probably find, if you start looking for them, come from the ancient Greeks. Plato said that rhetoric is the art of winning the soul by discourse. Aristotle said that rhetoric is the faculty of discovering in any particular case all of the available means of persuasion. Notice what's in common in both of those definitions. Winning, persuasion. Rhetoric is about convincing people to do or think or say or believe something. So the study of rhetoric is the study of all the things that you can do to try to get your message across to your audience. Some more recent definitions. The English philosopher Sir Francis Bacon said that rhetoric is the application of reason to imagination for the better moving of the will. So Bacon combines the idea of reason, logic, and imagination, creativity, to say that rhetoric is the process by which you try to move people's will, to change people's minds. Rhetoric can be written, it can be spoken. Rhetoric is all around you. One of the key ideas of AP Language is that everything is an argument. This PowerPoint that you're looking at right now, although not much has happened yet in it, this PowerPoint is an example of rhetoric. It's me being persuasive, trying to convince you that something is worth knowing. So we're going to start out our study of rhetoric by looking at what we call the rhetorical triangle. So let's take a look at the rhetorical triangle. Okay, so what you're seeing right now on your screen is a representation of the rhetorical triangle. The rhetorical triangle says that in any situation where someone is trying to convince someone else of something, there are three elements. There's what we call the speaker's persona, there's the speaker's purpose, and there's the audience to which the speaker is speaking or writing or doing whatever it is that they are doing. Now, what do we mean by persona? Well, persona is the identity that the speaker takes on, how they elect to present themselves. We all use different personas all the time. You don't act the same way around your parents as you do around your teachers and as you do around your friends and as you do around your coaches, because those people will react better to you depending on different ways that you present yourself. You make conscious choices about the you that you are going to be in order to get what you want from that audience. The purpose is a little more straightforward. The purpose is what we're hoping to accomplish. And like I said in the previous slide, everything has a purpose. Any time that one human being is communicating something to another one, they are trying to get something accomplished. So this PowerPoint definitely has a purpose. I'm trying to teach you some things and make you think that they're worth knowing, right? When you watch a television show, it has a purpose, even if that purpose is just to entertain you. The third element of the rhetorical triangle is the audience. The audience is pretty self-explanatory. It's the person who is receiving the message. The reason that these three elements are arranged in a triangle is because they all influence each other. A speaker is going to change their persona to accommodate a particular kind of audience, just like a speaker's persona might be influenced by their purpose. Certain purposes are only going to be received by certain audiences, and certain purposes require a certain kind of persona. And lastly, if you know that you have to speak to a particular audience, it's going to affect your purpose and persona. This might sound a little confusing right now, so let's take a look at an example. I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about the Lou Gehrig speech, which is in your textbook. The speech starts on page 1 and continues on to page 2. It's only it's less than 500 words, so take a minute and read the speech before we go any further. There's also a link on Blackboard to a video newsreel about the speech, so that might give you some more of the background information. Okay, so hopefully you've read the speech, and now we can talk a little bit about it. What you see right now is a picture of Lou Gehrig about to deliver his farewell speech to the crowd at Yankee Stadium. What you're seeing in this picture could all qualify as what we call context. Context are all the things that are going on around communication that affect those different elements of the rhetorical triangle. So as you know from looking at it in the chapter, the context is that it's July 4th, 1939, and we're at Yankee Stadium, which is in New York City. The guy you see in the foreground there is Lou Gehrig. Lou Gehrig is one of the most famous baseball players of all time. He was a legendary athlete in his own day and remains one today. Lou Gehrig contracted Lou Gehrig's disease, which is also known as ALS. And he was no longer able to play baseball. After a very long career, his health was failing, so he was going to retire from the game. And the Yankee fans decided to honor him with a day celebrating him at Yankee Stadium before a baseball game. So all that's context, the time, the place, everything that's going on around the communication. Alright, so now that we understand a little bit about the context in which Gehrig was speaking, let's talk about his purpose. Now, Gehrig was given an opportunity to talk to the fans. There were all these people who were there because they appreciated him, and so he was given sort of a chance to talk back to them. And so he had to select a purpose. There were several purposes that he could have selected. Lou Gehrig was a widely celebrated athlete who had accomplished many great things and obviously had all these adoring fans. He could have used this speech as an opportunity to sort of revel in all the things that he had accomplished. He was also someone who had had something very unfortunate happen to him. Oh, that's my dog. She's excited about Lou Gehrig. He was someone who had something very unfortunate happen to him. So he could have used this speech to sort of wallow in self-pity and talk about how sad it was what had happened to him. Also, this illness that had befallen Lou Gehrig was something that could have made him very upset. Maybe he could have used this speech to talk about how angry he was about the lack of funding for ALS or something like that. But Gehrig elected not to follow any of those purposes. Instead, he used his speech to try and inspire people, make them feel better about sort of life, bad things that happen in it. And so that was the purpose that he elected to follow in his speech, and everything else that happens in it is obviously affected by the purpose that he elected to use. Okay, so the next element of the rhetorical triangle that we're going to talk about is audience. So Gehrig had a message that he wanted to send, but that message would only work with a particular audience. He was talking to a huge crowd of fans, people who would be already respectful of him, people who would be open to the things he had to say. He was talking to a crowd at Yankee Stadium that today might look something like this. A whole bunch of people who were there to salute their hero. They would be really open to his message. But it'd be possible that he could have a different audience. Sometimes the crowd at Yankee Stadium looks like this. These people wouldn't be nearly as interested in taking in Gehrig's message of humility and thankfulness and everything else. So his purpose will only work with a particular audience. Likewise, his audience is only open to some purposes. Even this audience that would be very supportive might turn on him if he gave a speech about how upset he was that something bad had happened to him and how life wasn't fair and he wished that his life was just great all the time or something. Alright, and then the third element of the rhetorical triangle is the speaker's persona. Persona is a word that comes from the Greek word for mask. It's how the speaker chooses to present themselves in a given situation. So Gehrig makes decisions about how he wants to appear to his audience in order to get his purpose across to them. Now, here's a picture of Lou Gehrig. Lou Gehrig already had a well-established persona in the media of the time. He was viewed as being a very sort of humble, down-to-earth, straightforward guy. And you can maybe see that in this picture. Gehrig would have had a hard time selling himself as a comedian or something like that, or someone who is very educated and polished. He has to come across as who he is. By contrast, here's a picture of Lou Gehrig with one of his former teammates, Babe Ruth. You can see in this picture that Ruth has a really different personality, where Gehrig, in this picture, looks a little embarrassed by the bear hug that he's getting from Babe Ruth. Gehrig is obviously kind of a low-key kind of person. You can see the way that Ruth's personality comes across in a much broader way. You can imagine if Ruth was giving a speech to the crowd at Yankee Stadium, it would have been a bit more over the top, maybe, than Gehrig's very humble speech. Here's a picture of a current famous Yankee. Here's Alex Rodriguez electing to have himself photographed kissing his own reflection in the mirror. Obviously, Alex Rodriguez would have a really hard time pulling off a humble speech like Gehrig's, where he acts like he's very grateful for things and doesn't deserve some of what he's earned. So Gehrig's public persona that he already had established worked well with that particular audience and the purpose he was hoping to accomplish. So remember, we're talking about the rhetorical triangle. 3 things that influence what goes on when someone employs rhetoric. They make a decision about what they're trying to accomplish. They make a decision about who they're going to try and accomplish that goal with. Who are they speaking to? And then they make a decision about how they choose to represent themselves. And all 3 of those decisions are connected. So let's look at another example. If you're looking at your textbook still, towards the end of this section of the chapter, on page 9, you'll see a letter written by Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein wrote this letter in 1936 to a 6th grade student, a young lady who had written him asking him whether scientists pray, and if so, who do they pray to? So in writing this letter, Einstein had to make some decisions about his persona. Keep in mind that even in 1936, Albert Einstein was the most famous scientist in the country. He had a number of personas that he could have chosen to use. He could have presented himself as as this Albert Einstein, as a composed, thoughtful, self-controlled man. But here's another side of Einstein. This is an image that a lot of you are probably familiar with, where we see that Einstein was actually also famous for his use of humor, for his big personality. Maybe he could have presented himself as Einstein the physicist, Einstein the thinker, and really explained things to this girl and gotten into all sorts of equations and things like that. But obviously none of those personas are what that situation called for. Instead, as you see in the letter, Einstein presents himself as kind of a thoughtful, kindly, almost grandfatherly, we could at least say avuncular, figure who's sort of speaking to this young lady in a way that's not going to overwhelm her, but also doesn't come across as patronizing. Einstein also had to think about his audience. This is the kind of audience that Einstein might be used to thinking to. Einstein's a scientist. He's used to talking to people who are interested in hearing the end result of all his long years of study, people who are able to understand complex scientific jargon. But theoretically, Einstein's writing to this audience. This is a picture of a classroom I found from 1936. So he's talking to someone like this, not someone who would be in that lecture hall. But it's more complicated than that, because Einstein's audience are actually these people. Remember that this letter was published in a newspaper. So even though Einstein acted like he was writing for an audience of a 6th grader, he was actually writing for a very wide audience. So he has to be careful not to use language that's going to overwhelm them, to come across as someone who's sympathetic in the way that he talks to this 6th grade girl. And he has to be fair around the fact that in this letter that he's writing about science and prayer, he's treading in some difficult areas. So let's take a look at something about his purpose. What is Einstein's purpose? Well, the letter seems like it's going to have to get Einstein involved in this old debate between religion and science. which is a difficult place to be. But remember, he's speaking as kind of a kindly, wise old man speaking to someone, trying to help her out with a problem, not drag her into a political debate. Remember also that he's writing for a national audience and doesn't want to offend anyone. So instead, Einstein makes his purpose talking about the wonder of the cosmos, and how as a scientist, the more he's learned, the more he understands that there are things out there that he doesn't understand. So instead of making his purpose to win a debate, he makes his purpose to acknowledge the complexity of the issue. This is a setup that's going to work well given the audience that he's been given and the persona that he elected to adopt. So remember the rhetorical triangle: persona, purpose, and audience. Anytime someone's communicating in spoken word, in written word, in a photograph, there's some sense of who is the speaker, who are they speaking to, and what are they trying to say. And if you change any one of those elements, you have to change the others.